Of course I can't see this stuff. Okay, cool. LinkedIn is live and just got to go live on Instagram. And we should be set. Okay, if you're joining, let me know in the chat so I know that I can see the messages coming through. That would be super helpful. Thank you so much. This is going to be a talk on code reviews, and we're not going to go through code reviews and pull requests. We're going to talk about code reviews, pull requests, and sort of that culture that you can have on your team for these things. So I did write a newsletter article on this. I will put that in the chat. If you are on a platform where that chat is not coming through, I'm going to try it on Instagram. I have no idea if that's going to work. But if you're on a platform where that chat is not coming through, it is at weekly.devleader.ca. That's where you can find my newsletter. I'm not telling you to sign up for it, but if you want to stay in touch with what a lot of these live streams are about for Monday nights here in Seattle, then that's what they're about. But like all live streams, I do highly encourage you to participate. Please ask questions as I go along. I don't care if it's unrelated. I would much rather, pause what I'm doing to answer questions that you have, because that's why I'm live. If it's just me reciting things, then I could go make a YouTube video about that, and I would much rather get a better use of your time. So please do ask in the chat. I will be watching across the different platforms. They're across all my screens right now. If you've seen pictures of my setup, then you know that I have a lot of screens to watch as I'm talking to all of you. So, with that said, ask questions. I will leave some time at the end as well. So usually these streams are about an hour, and I will try to make sure that I leave time at the end. And that way, if you were kind of waiting for an opportunity because you didn't want to jump in and, ask something unrelated, then you can jump in at the end. So hopefully that sounds cool. Like I said, let me know. I'm going to refresh my chat because I don't see... It's saying that only some of them are coming through, and I don't trust that. Okay, now it's saying all 6 of 6, and let me get my chat turned on so you guys can see what's coming through too, in case people start getting noisy. Okay, so to start things off, pull requests, code reviews. Well, what are those? Why do we do them? Right, so this is something that is not necessarily enforced at all companies, but most companies have some type of, pull request or code review process in place. And the idea in general is that you are getting more eyes on the code that you're putting out there so that people can make sure that it is safe to commit, that it is following architectural patterns, that you've put tests in place, all sorts of things, right? And that's what's kind of cool, because depending on the team, your organization, there are different things that you value and different reasons why you might be doing code reviews and pull requests. That's going to be, I just realized how confusing that's going to be to keep saying that. I'm going to probably say code requests and pull reviews. Get ready for it, because I can already feel it's going to happen. So yeah, we do these for a lot of different reasons. I listed some of them, but it's one way that we can get some of that feedback, right? It's not the only way, but it's one way. And generally how these things are set up are that you are making changes in your local environment as a software developer, and then you can commit those changes. So most commonly people are using Git these days for source control. There are other source control tools. I don't know anyone today that's using anything other than Git. I feel like it's kind of won out in the source control race, if that was ever a thing. So yeah, most people are using Git. So you would make a commit locally, and then you would push that up. And this is where things get very different, right? So if you have no code review process in place and no gating system there, you might just be able to push to a destination, so a remote branch. The code lands, voila, right? If you have a build system, it might kick off, but generally what we try to do is have a gating pull request or code review system, so that when that code goes up, then you can add people to go review that on some platform. And there are lots of different platforms. I'm not going to go into the details of those, especially because if you're watching this, you're probably working as a software developer and you know what the heck I'm talking about. I like to over-explain things because this is recorded. There will be other people that join. and they might not know. So try to explain. FileZilla, baby, the OG. Yeah. Um, that's right. Some people did things before source control. And a lot of us, especially early on when we're developing software, right? Like, um, you know, you might have found yourself writing code before you knew how to use Git, or like I started with Subversion, and we were making copies of our code folder, right? Like, here's a snapshot, like it's working, like don't touch that one. I'm going to go copy it over here and start messing it up. And then when that works, that becomes my good copy. But we have source control for that now, fortunately. So FileZilla, you can do it. I'm proud of you if you moved on from it though. So yeah, we do have these code review tools, and like I said, there's many of them that exist. And then these allow us generally to collaborate and look at code together. Um, some are more fancy than others for sure. But the idea is that you can have your peers join in, look at your code, and give you feedback. So probably doesn't sound very surprising to a lot of you. You're going, yep, I know, been doing that. Good stuff. There are situations where you may not have gating code reviews. Um, and just checking chat here, we now technically call that the last known good. That's right. So if you're taking snapshots of your code folder, that's the last known good. So there are situations where code reviews and pull requests are not necessarily gating, and that might just be because in the team setup you have, you don't have that kind of stuff configured yet. I would say it's probably easy enough these days where most people, even at small startups and stuff, it's something you do early on. But I've definitely seen where that's not the case. And I will come back to this later because I want to go through a lot of these different ideas about like code review culture and revisit this idea. And I want to seed it early because for people that are joining or you might be watching this, I want you to stick around and kind of think about what this might mean. But what would it mean to be in a situation where you don't need code reviews and pull requests? Sounds maybe kind of crazy, right? How could we possibly do that? Wouldn't that be defying all things? But remember what I said at the very, very beginning of this. Sorry if you just joined, but I did say at the beginning that these tools enable a bunch of things for us, but they're only one such tool that enables those things. So keep that in mind. Maybe have a think through that as we go along here. Okay, let's talk about code review culture. So the reason I wanted to write about this is because I've worked in both startups and in big tech now at Microsoft. Worked at a couple of different teams at Microsoft. Certainly not someone who's been at Microsoft for 20 plus years and seen a lot of the evolution of Microsoft. So from Microsoft perspective, I'm still very, very new to Microsoft. So when I do talk about Microsoft, I don't want to make it sound like I'm trying to claim like I know all of how all the different teams operate and things like that. I'm just going to share some insights from my experiences. And similarly, I've worked at startups, but I can't obviously speak on behalf of all startups. So I do want you to keep that in mind as I talk. There will be a lot of generalizations. I will try to call those out, but I need you to know that my goal is not to overly generalize and then have you think like this is the way that it must be, right? For everything, it's just not the case. Just doing a double check. My audio is coming through on TikTok. I did one of these live streams and TikTok was like, hey, it looks like there's no activity. We're going to shut you down. I was like, what the heck's going on? And then I realized my my audio wasn't turned on for TikTok. So that must have been probably one of the worst streams ever. But that's okay. So code review culture. Why do we do it? Talked about a few reasons, but code review culture can have a really big effect on the productivity of a team. And when I think about startups and big tech, there's, again, generalization here, but there's usually this situation where I feel like at startups I don't want to say we're rushing, but like we're moving generally at a faster pace, right? We're moving at a faster pace, shipping code faster, we're creating bugs faster. Like there's a lot more rapid iteration generally. And that will mean that maybe how we approach doing code reviews and pull requests, those systems, those processes for us might look different. And my experience at Microsoft has been that it's slower, arguably more methodical, if I can say that. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's just slower because things are moving slower in general. How we might deploy changes and how things are moving is slower on purpose because it's more cautious. A bunch of different things going on there, but I would say that these things look different. Now, you could be at a small company as well, and maybe these things are moving slower. So, like I said, I wanted to put this together to talk about some different aspects about pull requests, code reviews, to get you thinking like, hey, I'm working on a team right now. Maybe parts of your development life cycle are going well. Maybe some other parts aren't, and that's okay, right? If you are able to kind of identify what challenges you're facing, like, hey, I'm just going to give you an example. Hey, I'm putting up code and I find like I can make it through my code changes pretty quick, but it takes me like a week to get feedback to get things through, or 2 weeks, and you're like trying to do other work at the same time, and the context switching is really heavy. So we'll talk through some of that. Maybe you're finding like I'm getting code reviews and pull requests from everyone. The last team I was on, even as a manager, I was, because of how our ownership was set up in different repositories, like I would get added to tons of pull requests just by default, right? Like the team would get added. So like that became noise for me. So I would ignore those until someone said, hey, Nick, could you please look at it? Right. So that became the culture. That became the norm. These are things that you can think about as we go through this and say, hey, if I like that, how do I encourage it? And if I don't like it, can I explain why I don't like it and maybe propose an alternative? That's ultimately the goal here, just to get you thinking through some stuff. Okay, so this was a shorter newsletter for me. We finally had some nice weather here in Seattle. I feel like I've been saying like, oh, like finally summer's here, and I'm like, wait a second, it's like almost the end of June. Like, are we are we about to miss summer? We're gonna get one weekend or something, and it's nice. Finally, not raining. But no, it was a quicker newsletter for me. Generally, go through these things pretty quick. But sorry, I said that wrong. I don't go through these things pretty quick. This one I went through quickly. This is what happens when I try to read and talk at the same time. So this one I did do a little bit quicker, but I figured I'd get it together as like a list and try to make it more actionable. And that way you don't have to listen to my droning on in my newsletter. You can just say, cool, give me a list of stuff to think through. So the things I kind of listed off here, I'm just going to go through some of the benefits again, just in case I missed any. So I wrote down things like sharing knowledge, right? So doing code reviews, even if you're not thinking about the code itself and trying to critique it and look at the design and the architecture and the test cases, I'll touch on these in a moment. Even if you're not doing that, there is a benefit that you could be literally just being exposed to more parts of the code base, exposed to the changes that are coming through, so you're more cognizant of what's going on. So there is a benefit to that. You can have more junior people get pulled onto code reviews for context so they can start to learn about the changes coming through. There's a lot of great knowledge sharing that can occur because of this. So that is one benefit. Reminder, it's not the only way to get this benefit, but that is one benefit. This one I think is probably a little bit more obvious, and I mentioned it earlier, but like it's like really critiquing the code, right? So feedback on the patterns, the practices, the approach that you're taking. And something that's nice about this is that, and if you're not familiar, and maybe you're someone who's more junior kind of coming into industry, but a lot of code bases are not not great. And it's not because someone sat there and said, I'm purposefully going to write terrible code. It's because someone set out with best intentions, and over time things evolve. And the fact that you're still working in a code base that's been around for 5-10 years is remarkable, that code has lived on that long. So there's gonna be parts of it that don't look great. So what you'll often find is that there are inconsistencies in the patterns, right? Because someone might have said, hey, this is the new way after we've learned, after a couple years, we're going to move in that direction. And you might be working in an older spot and you might start copying and pasting some of the patterns. And on a code review, someone will go, hey, no, like we don't do that way anymore. that's 2 patterns ago. Like you're missing it. And you can get feedback on that to say, hey, you should try this other way out. This is the new established way, and here's why. A thing that I have really enjoyed, if you have testing in mind, and it is a bit of a culture thing on a team, is that you get exposure to people thinking through test cases, looking at what you've put there, and being able to say, like, hey, I noticed you added coded tests in this area. I'm saying coded tests, by the way, not specifically unit, integration, functional, because it doesn't matter. It's not for me to say. There are some type of coded tests. Or they might say, hey, there are no tests. Why is that the case, right? How did you validate this? How are you going to make sure that we're covered for regression, right? All these sorts of things. So you have people that can have an extra set of eyes looking for that. This one is already kind of included in some of the things I mentioned, but basically having situations where you might not be the subject matter in an area, subject matter expert. I missed a word. You might not be the subject matter expert in an area, and you might be making changes there, and the subject matter expert can say, hey, like, by the way, like, this might be an edge case or something else we have to think about as we're designing this. Here's why. So you can have those people put on to give you more of that insight. And the last thing I wrote in this little list here was that when you have more people on a code review, right, more of your teammates and stuff, I talk about tech debt a lot, and I think it's because it's just a natural part of software development, and some people are very, very much like, no tech debt ever, like you can't ever have tech debt, we have to do everything to stop it. I just say it's going to happen, so learn to adapt and live with it, and prioritize the tech debt that needs to be paid down. So one of the things I like to call out is that if you have other people that are looking at the tech debt that's coming along, right, you might be making a conscious decision and saying, we are introducing tech debt here on purpose to be able to accomplish this goal. So you have more people having awareness of, hey, this is the bad pattern, but we understand why for this case. You might have people that are saying, hey, look, like, you're introducing tech debt here and no one's acknowledged this yet, right? Like you're kind of going around the established pattern, or you're taking what we might consider a shortcut architecturally. Like, I'm putting my hand up to say, hey, there's tech debt here. Or, I perceive that you're about to create some tech debt. Have we thought through this? So all of those things I think are, and there's more, right? So if you're in the chat and you're like, well, Nick, you didn't say this, like, please, like, share. I will gladly read it out and we can chat through it. But those are a handful of different things that you can get from having pull requests and code reviews. So Rick here from Twitter. So yes, get comfortable with how and why to use tech debt. Great advice. Well, thank you so much for confirming my bias. No, but I think it's important, right? I don't want to say other people are wrong. Like, I think there's a lot of different ways to write software, but at the end of the day, when I'm creating software with teams, I want to prioritize shipping value to customers because they're the ones who pay the bills. That's it. And customers, people hate hearing this, but like, customers, they don't care about your code. They don't care about your infrastructure. They don't care about your test cases. They literally care that you are solving their problems and that it's a good value for them. Now, the side effects that they will feel from you having crappy code, from you having terrible, flaky tests that never run and give you no confidence, from having like all these bad things that you want to address, the side effect is that they generally end up getting features slower over time, broken features that are lower quality over time. But those are the side effects, right? They will feel those. So if you're in a position and you're like, why do we never prioritize tech debt? They don't let me write the clean code. We just have garbage spaghetti code everywhere, and it's really upsetting to you because no one's prioritizing it. I think you just need to change your messaging and work on communicating. And I realize that I'm oversimplifying that. I talk about this a lot, by the way, so I'm not gonna stay on my soapbox here for too long going off the rails on it, but I genuinely think that most of the time this comes down to a communication problem between engineers who are very passionate about having cleaner code that's easier to navigate, more testable, all of these good characteristics. We have a gap between those individuals and the people that are working on prioritizing things for the users. Now, it takes communication from both sides. So even if you are doing an excellent job communicating that as an engineer, the person who might be, you call them your product owner, just for generalization here, they might not be understanding it, right? So you might have to do an alternative. I don't want to say a better way to communicate, but like an alternative way to communicate so they can understand. And the flip side, right? You might be the engineer who's not doing a good job communicating it. I have been on both sides of this. Before Microsoft, I was a software engineer and an engineering manager for 8 years in parallel. So I got to work with my team and live the tech debt, the pain, and also be on the side of like the product owner, like working with our product manager and kind of having a product owner role, and just working with the team to be like, let's make a good business case for this tech debt, or paying down the tech debt, right? If you're going to introduce it or you're going to clean it up. So all important stuff. But again, pull requests and code reviews, I think, give you that opportunity to kind of come together and say, like, we're acknowledging this is a thing, and if we're missing it, let's make sure we are acknowledging it. Okay, so I think code reviews and pull requests have a lot of these awesome benefits, but I think depending on your culture, when I say your culture, I mean like the culture of your team. I don't mean like your individual culture, so let me clarify that. That's that's dangerous. Based on your team's culture and how you approach pull requests, code reviews, that kind of thing, I think that they can dramatically improve the productivity of a team, or I think that they can have sort of a negative effect and slow a whole team down. Even if you're offering some of these great benefits that we just talked through, I think that based on how you approach these things, you might find that your productivity actually drops. So as we go through this next little set of like different things to think about, I don't want to say, like, I'm not suggesting to you like this is the way to do it. I just want to give you a bunch of different things to think through. And I'm going to answer Andy Young here from Twitter. Hey, Nick, what's one thing your senior direct reports understood about management? Can you clarify that a little bit? I'll try to answer, but as I'm answering, if you want to clarify, because you might see that I'm not answering you accurately, I'd like to do a good job here. So what's one thing your senior direct reports understood about management? So I would say, okay, so I think more of my senior direct reports understand some of the business decisions a little bit better. And it's just because they've been exposed to those types of things a little bit more. So, for example, I'm trying to think. I'm gonna make up a hypothetical situation, but kind of explain why I think that this pans out. Say if we have to pivot on a project, right? We've been working on it, and some new priorities come up from leadership, or at startups, it would be a lot less about like leadership, from a corporate structure having different priorities, and more about like some urgent customer thing coming up. I found that generally my more senior direct reports are able to understand why a pivot is beneficial. Not always, and I think like that's on me as an engineering manager to make sure that I can convey the why accurately. I think that's extremely important. I was doing a lot of that today, actually, in my one-on-ones, was going through some stuff, and I'm like, hey, we're not changing what we're doing, but here's a new why we should do it. So I think my more senior engineers seem to get that a little bit more, which is nice. And the more junior folks, I feel like it's because it's almost like and this, I don't mean for this to sound insulting or condescending, but like lack of exposure to business. Right? They're fresh out of college or university. Maybe they're a boot camp grad, or this is kind of their first job. They might not have seen like, hey, look, we need to ship value to customers. That's how we get paid as a company. Like that's how the company makes money. They might go, we write code and we get a paycheck, right? They don't have that connection to like, we need to do the thing for the customer. So I would say the business value part and shifting priorities, I think they seem to get a lot better. Andy, let me know if that is an example that made sense, or if you want to hear something else. But like I said, if that's not an answer you're kind of looking for the right direction, just if you add a little bit more context, I'm happy to try and pivot my answer there. Oh, it took me over a decade to make that connection. Yeah. I'll take a little bit of a tangent here too, just on this note from Andy. So I don't know. I've seen Andy on Twitter and stuff, so the face is familiar. But I don't know Andy's background for coding, right? One thing that when people are saying like, hey, like, I want to go, they're new software developers. Hey, I want to get into big tech. I'd love to work at Microsoft, or, refer me, whatever it happens to be. And there's a lot of people that are chasing big tech, which I'm not saying right or wrong. See a lot of it, of course. Like, I didn't start in big tech, and to be quite honest, I never set out as that for that to be a goal of mine. It just wasn't really on my mind as like must end up there. But I would say, without a doubt, working at startups absolutely allowed me to make that connection that Andy's talking about in the chat, that I was just talking through about this. Like, we need to ship value to customers. And the I think the best example of that was when I was working before Microsoft. The company was called Magnet Forensics, and when I joined, it was like 8 people, and we were the underdog digital forensics company. And it was like, look, we're in an accelerator center, so we basically had like 3 offices with the walls knocked down, like with the sliding. What do you call them? It's like a sliding wall that you can kind of open up, a partition. That's the word. It's a computer science thing too. So we had these partitions opened up, but there was 8 of us in this office, and like, we didn't have investors, and the company did have customers, so they were profitable, they could pay. But it was like, look, like, we need to make this work. Like, we need to make it work. And I think extremely early on developing with that company, there was this strong like understanding of like, it's us. And when I say us, I mean everyone in the company, not just the engineers, the sales, the marketing team. Although the engineers were like, it's all us. Like, that's how we think. But it was all of us there. We need to make this work. So it was like, yeah, as programmers, we're writing stuff and we're like, oh, this is gross. Like, we'd love to do it a different way, but we're like, take note of it and we'll come back to it if we need to, because there might not be a comeback to it if we don't get this shipped. And there was in the beginning, I'm not trying to dance around it. There was a ton of these situations at the beginning where we're like that's definitely cutting corners, or like we go look at the code like from last week and we're like, oh my God, how did we do that? So the amount of tech debt accrual in the beginning was nuts. Absolutely nuts. And I did a lot of it, and I'm sorry, but I had to do it. And spoiler alert, that company ended up doing very successful. They ended up going public. So moral of the story is, you can put a ton of tech debt into a product. It can still work. You can come back and revisit things if they make sense and they're a priority. Like, you got to keep shipping value to customers. But I think the startup situation really helped with that, to reinforce it. But that's it. Not your tech debt anymore. Yeah. I said, I'm out of here, guys. See you later. I started off, not every single product, certainly not the original one, but most of the code base I had started off the original projects and stuff. So by the end of my time there, it was kind of, I've told people this, where it felt like I would start my day and I would just be jumping from team to team, trying to be like, they'd be like, hey, we want to go in this direction. Like, I know you kind of dabbled in this. Like, what are your thoughts? And I would be like, oh no, you're about to go touch that part of the code. And then would kind of like, back them away from the cliff, and then would run to the next team and they would tell me a similar story. And I'm like, oh no. Yeah, it was kind of like not an actual nightmare, but like metaphorically, it was like this nightmare where I'm like, oh no, all this code that I created, and I'm so sorry. But yeah, no, it was good times. But definitely startups, I think, can give you some of that insight. Okay, pull requests, code reviews. So one thing, and this is my first thing that I do actually highly recommend. There are always exceptions. I don't like saying it's a rule, But a very strong guideline I would like to encourage: small modular commits. So the pull request you're going to be dealing with, the review you're looking at, is small and modular. Now you might say, hey, I had to refactor a bunch of code, I had to do a big rewrite, and there was no way to do it small and modular. I would say, yeah, I bet you there was a way. I'm not saying it's going to be easy. It might have felt very artificial and cumbersome to try and break it up. So I get it, there's exceptions, but it's always doable. It's just how much work you want to put into it, because there's a trade-off. But the reason I like saying small and modular commits is multiple reasons. But from the perspective of a code review, it's the sort of like the tax or the burden you're going to put on the reviewers to go understand your code. Right? So if you think about, if you've been working in industry for a while, I am sure you've seen the code reviews that come in and there's 50 files touched, 100 files touched, and you're like, okay, you want me to sign off on this, and you click through a couple and you're like, okay, I see the pattern. Like, are you telling me that you're going to go sit there and go through 100 files to go see, a typo fixed? And like, or even worse, like that one's actually not bad. You go through 100 files and you're like, there is no pattern. Like, you've just touched 100 files in 10,000 different ways. Like, what do you want from me here? So I think when your commits are small and modular, they're a lot easier to digest for people, and then you can get more meaningful context and comments in your discussions for your code reviews. So that is something I do highly recommend. I would say, if you're unable to in the situation that you're in, because like I said, there's always exceptions, is try to communicate up front. So whether that's a brief call, whether that's a bit of a write-up for your review, to give people the context, like, hey, look, these are the major patterns I want you to be thinking about. This is how I did approach things. And that way people aren't just like trying to figure out what they need to be paying attention to if the pull request is bigger. So a couple thoughts there. Something else I wrote here is early and often can be your friend. Now this, and if you think through these as I'm talking about them, you'll maybe have different perspectives where you're like, I can see that working well, or I can see that being like a total pain in the butt. The early and often one, I think, is one of those double-edged swords where I say early and often because small and modular commits allow you to push more code earlier and do it often because they're smaller. Now, you might say, well, Nick, that's going to give someone on the team like 50 code reviews a day to go review. Like, how are they ever going to do that? And then I go, yeah, like there's the trade-off, right? These are things you want to talk about with your team. But if you had a lot of small modular ones, they might take you almost no time at all. And you go, yeah, checks out. Like, I can understand this makes sense. You have a typo, cool, like fix it, great, move on. But the early and often thing I like, not only for having the small bite size pull requests, but also the feedback, right? I know there's going to be someone watching this. I'm going to say the word agile and they're going to lose their mind. It doesn't work. Forget agile. Let's talk about feedback loops. Sorry if I've triggered anyone. Let's talk about feedback loops. Ideally, we have shorter feedback loops so that we can understand if we're on the right track. So I would say for code reviews, one way to help prevent having an enormous pull request is to get the feedback early, right? You don't want to have that enormous pull request and someone goes, dude, you did the wrong thing. And you're like, I just spent 2 weeks writing this code. I touched 1,000 files and now you're telling me it's wrong. Right? So getting some feedback early, something I've seen work really well is using drafts. So you could have a draft pull request to kind of show the idea, making some of the changes in one spot and say, hey, here's the idea I'm thinking about. It's not just written down. You can see some of the code changes and get that feedback and go, what do you think about this? Is this looking good? Because if it's not, I'm not going to go waste like 2 more weeks making the changes. So Andy, I see your question. I'm going to read this one from Instagram. Someone told me pull requests could be too dirty with too many commits. And this is why I'm saying, yeah, it's definitely a balance. So thanks, Hector. it's definitely a balance. I think you want to think about this with your team because, if you take it to an extreme and you have, say you have 7 engineers on a team and everyone's doing 10 pull requests a day, 10 commits a day, right? Like, what's going on? And now the other thing too, and I don't have the full context from Hector in this comment, but someone told me pull requests could be too dirty with too many commits. If it's a single pull request with too many commits in the pull request, yeah. So I would say like you don't want to be just tacking on tons of changes, and sometimes it might be an indicator that if you've done tons and tons of revisions on something, we might have started in the wrong spot. So yeah, Hector, I know there's might be a couple different ways to approach answering that, but hopefully that kind of helps. I do think that if you have too many changes in one pull request, it's overwhelming. And if you have too many tiny, tiny, tiny changes, it can be overwhelming for a team. So a balance there. Andy asks, are you on an incident manager rotation currently, or your IC's on call? How are they handling that? Yeah. So incident manager at Microsoft is like a special role, and I am not an incident manager. So a little bit of context. We do have on-call rotations, and I say we as in the individuals within Office 365, and I will be referring to that as Substrate because Substrate is the infrastructure for Office 365. Within Substrate, there are incident managers. Incident managers work sort of at a higher level across the teams that are operating on call, and they can help with incidents. So it's kind of like a cross-functional on call with more authority. So it would be like very props to the people that are doing it, because I can imagine how stressful that would be. I'm the kind of person, if I don't feel like an expert in an area, like I get a lot of anxiety. I've been kind of open about this before, that like putting myself in new situations, I'm like, oh, I don't want to do that. But then people force me into a new situation, it feels uncomfortable for a bit, and I feel great. So yeah, maybe someday incident manager for me, but not today is not that day. On call. So interestingly, I switched teams earlier this year. I have my first on call rotation coming up on this team, which I've been on call prior to this team. Like for 3 years, I had on call rotations. I'm super nervous to do this one because I haven't done it for the team. But it's like when we talk about imposter syndrome, right? Like, I know that I'm capable of doing it. I need to remind myself, like, the whole world isn't coming after me if something's wrong. Like, I have a whole team to support me. So I have to keep reminding myself that. But yeah, there's anxiety leading up to it. I find it challenging as an engineering manager because I'm not in the code. I'm not in operating with the services like the engineers are. When I was on deployment prior to the team that I'm on now, in order for engineers to get their changes out on my team, they have to deploy them. And we were the deployment team too. So even going through the process of making changes, they're exercising all of our infrastructure and getting more and more familiar with it. But I'm not doing that. So my familiarity came with being on call and then working close to the engineers and understanding what's going on. So it's a tricky thing for me because it's infrequent and then it's wildly uncomfortable. And my team, I think, I don't want to say like it's easier for them, like as in, like it's not, they don't have to put in any effort. Like, yeah, like they put in a ton of effort and they do an awesome job. I think that they're able to probably jump into situations with more context faster than I am because they're closer to that stuff. But the rotations are periodic. It depends on the team what it looks like, but we're very fortunate that we work cross geography too. So we have support with other geographies coming online when we're, it's in our evening time and stuff like that. So it's not so bad. Yeah, and so yeah, hope you have good run books and support from your team. Absolutely. So we have a lot of documentation and stuff in place that's super helpful. It's sort of like the backbone of being on call is having a lot of these resources you can go to, and definitely like my previous team and this current team, the engineers are so awesome that like you're you might feel like even if it's late or something, you're like, oh no, like I'm alone and I have to solve this. But there's always people that are willing to help. And the fact that we are cross geo just really helps with that too. So, um, and then I think Harrison on Twitch, I'm a current data engineering intern at Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA. Do you have any advice or tips to prepare for post university life? So, with data engineering, I can't comment on that specifically, but my general advice is like a couple things, I guess. One is if you're able to during school internships or anything like that, if you can continue doing that, because I see you're, like you said, a data engineering intern currently. If you can keep up with internships, one of the best things that you can do, just having that work experience as you're going along is like, I feel like nothing beats that because that's the thing that a lot of people say they're missing when they graduate. They're like, I don't have any experience. And like, yeah, well, you do. I was very fortunate. I went to an honors co-op program at Waterloo. So I had 6 internships. I had 2 full years of work experience by the time I graduated, and it was super helpful. And in fact, I probably would not have stayed in university in what I was in if it weren't for the internships because I did not like school. So my advice, yeah, stick with internships if you can. Find ways, internships or not, to be able to practice the things that you would be doing at work. So for data engineering, like I said, I can't comment on that specifically. For software engineers, I say build software. It's not just grind, delete code, like go build things. Now, for interviewing, grind lead code because you're probably going to get some stuff like that in your interviews. But for data engineering, I would say like if there are things that you're doing at work, like working with different platforms, technology, like I would say like try doing some of that on the side so you can be practicing and experimenting and just getting familiar because it's all about getting I'll use a gym analogy, like getting your reps in, right? You want to be practicing stuff. That's my best recommendation. And second to that, some might argue like same kind of same level of importance, but I would say network. Don't wait to do it. Start building your network early. It's I feel like it's never been easier to network with people. You are literally talking to me right now. There's people in the chat you could be talking to. You can go on LinkedIn and start saying hi to people and engaging with them on their posts. It's never been easier. So do recommend it. Let me know if that helps or you have other questions. I'm happy to try and answer. Okay. Something back on code review culture comments. I realize I have more. I might go over time, so I hope you guys are okay going a little later. Comments on code reviews. Something that is very common, and I'm sure a bunch of you have seen this before. You're on a code review, and someone leaves you a comment, and they've done a little write-up for you. And you're reading through it and you're going, okay, I think I see what they're saying, not totally sure, but like let me write back and I'll clarify. So you write a little story back to them. And then they read yours and they write you another story and they're going, no, like here's what you're missing. And then you're going, no man, like you're missing it. So you write another one back. And now you're probably 5, 6, 7 comments in. And you're starting to get frustrated because Jim on the other team is just not understanding what you're talking about. And you're pretty confident you're right, but you're also like, I know Jim's a smart guy. Why can't he get this? There's a thing that you can do here, and it's to stop writing comments. Written communication, I know we're programmers and we write code, and that is a form of written communication. Written communication is absolutely horrendous at conveying things that we mean, right? I would say if you are able to talk in person, you're in the same office, poke your head around the corner and say, hey, Jim, we should talk about this. If you can't, hey, Jim, send him a message. Hey, Jim, do you got time for a call? Like, let's chat through these comments. You will find almost all of the time, Jim is not mean. Jim actually mostly understands what you're saying. You mostly understand what Jim is saying. There's a little bit of a discrepancy. You talk it through and you go, oh, why did we spend a full day almost passive aggressively sending each other these novels back and forth in comments just to have a call that took 3 minutes and 42 seconds to realize we're saying literally the same thing. So I honestly, it comes up so often, and I do recommend that you talk about this with your team. Like, what's a good threshold if we're not getting on the same page? How do people like to be communicated with outside of, leaving comments and stuff? What's a good way to do this? How can we get on the same page faster? So it's not that you can't leave comments. I just think that when they start going back and forth, try to find a different way to communicate. I can't pronounce your last name, so I apologize on YouTube. Anthony, hi Nick. How do you maintain a consistent code style across a team, documentation, editor config, Visual Studio rules, automated in some way during your code reviews? Yeah, so this is a great one. I am not actually. I don't want to say I'm not a fan. I'm almost like against a lot of stylistic things in code reviews, and I'm against it because I feel like it's such a okay. Let me back up. Readability in code is important. Let me start with that. I want to put that out there so I don't have people coming with pitchforks for me. Readability in code is important. I think having standards is important, but I find that as humans who are great at thinking through things, critical thinking, being creative, spending time on a code review trying to critique white space is like, it's the biggest waste of time ever. And you might say, well, no, Nick, it's important to have the consistency. And I say, sure. If you value that so much, if you value it so much, should you be spending your time on it, or should you have that in an automated way that literally no one ever has to think about it ever again? Because if you really value it, to Anthony's question here, is it automated in some way? I would say if you value it, like you don't want to spend time on it, you make it automatic so no one has to think about it. You're never wasting time on it again because that's how much you value it. Prioritize it, right? Think about how often you're spending time in code reviews just going back and fixing indentation or stupid stuff where you're like there are literally tools that can do this for you. You can write. We were talking today about writing Roslyn rules, not even for indentation and style type things, but for patterns. So again, if you're not from C# space and .NET space, I'm sure there's other types of static analysis things like this. I don't know your JavaScript and TypeScript ways, but in C# and .NET we have Roslyn, which allows us to write static analysis rules that look at the expressions in the language. And then so you can write static analysis rules that say, hey, like, don't do these types of things, and actually analyze the language that's been written. So we were talking about, hey, like, this is a potentially dangerous pattern. It can have dangerous side effects. We shouldn't leave it to someone to avoid coding it, to know all the time. We shouldn't leave it to all the reviewers to have to go chase it down all the time. Why don't we just prevent it from being typed in the first place? So I think that's a huge strategy that you can lean into. The Visual Studio rules, editor config and stuff, I would say, like, when you get into this kind of thing, you want to just make sure that you can keep it synchronized between your local dev environment and the build system. Because I think these types of tools can be very powerful, but when there is a discrepancy between your local dev environment and your builds, especially if your build systems can take more time, one thing that gets really problematic is you go, hey, great, it works. You push it up, it goes to build and it fails. And you check an hour later, you're busy doing stuff, right? You go back and you're like, what? Why didn't it pass? And you're like, oh, it's, you can't have an extra blank line here. Like, oh my God, okay. So you go take the extra blank line out, commit it again, push it up, only to find that there's another blank line or some other silly thing later. Like, you want to make sure that they're consistent between your dev environments and your build system, but I think they're super powerful. And what about more general consistency themes on not only syntax, like one developer likes functional? Yeah. So this is kind of a part of your first question, right? How do you maintain consistent code style across the team? So I know, like, I was talking more about like style in terms of like how pretty code looks, but in terms of patterns and stuff, this is a tricky one. because I think that like a strategy that helps is for things to be mostly consistent. But the problem is that as patterns need to evolve, right, we find better ways to do things. Let's walk through a little exercise. You have a code base, start it off, and I don't know how many files or how many classes we want to get into here, but you start it off, you start with these patterns and you start going, these patterns feel good, we like using them. Okay, so you start continuing to develop, building out the code base. Then something happens in the future. It might be, hey, look, a new language feature is available. It might be we've updated a package that we're using. It might be that you found that there's actually a critical flaw in the pattern that you've been leveraging, and if people aren't aware of something, they can introduce something dangerous. So you go, okay, we have this pattern everywhere, and it's been really helpful, but we need to start changing. Like we've figured out there's a better way to do this now. You have a couple of options. One is that you press pause, you stop delivering code, and you say, I and the team, or maybe just you solo, whoever, I'm going to go change all these things. I have to go through all of the code and change them. Now, if there's not many places and it's quick, it's not hard, maybe you do that, right? You bite the bullet, you say, we're changing this pattern, we're going to get it out of there. But that one doesn't scale so well because I'll give you an example. In Substrate, if we were changing our testing infrastructure, or even we're changing .NET versions, how many projects do you think there are? There's more than I ever could have dreamed was physically possible. So it's like one of those things that at some scale it might work well, and at other scales it doesn't. So all these things have context. So if you need to have some type of pattern change, generally what I suggest is that people get on the same page as a team, right? You communicate it out. Hey, this is the pattern. Here's the new way we're doing it. If you have things that you can put in place for static analysis to prevent it, great, right? That's extra work, but maybe depending on your code base, you want to prevent new introductions of this pattern. You could do that. You have the option to go change it all. Like I said, it doesn't scale. But what I would generally recommend is communication, a bit of documentation around it. And then you start to introduce this pattern going forward. And then you take on the mindset, like this is where people will say, hey, if you're going back, touching an area of code, make it better than when you left it. I'm on the fence about this one, but I would say this might be if you're like touching an area and you have to go overhaul it anyway, introduce the new pattern. Don't just reuse the old one. Now, if you were fixing the world's tiniest bug and you say, oh, also, we happen to be using this pattern nearby, I should go change it because I was already in this file. That's where I say, not so fast. If you are going to do that, at least make it a separate commit. But it might just not be a priority. You might literally be introducing risk and you're not even aware of it. But I think those are conversations you want to have with your team. So I hope that helps. I am the kind of person who I would rather be in a code base with more patterns moving in a direction that we're happy about. Some people will disagree with that and say it becomes too much of a nightmare to navigate. That's fine. But I think this is something you want to talk about with your team. My personal belief is that code is always evolving and it's never going to be perfect. So basically continue introducing new patterns if they make sense, communicating out as you need to make changes about them. And then if you're like, hey, it's getting too crazy, we have too many patterns, so you put your hand up for the tech debt and you say, hey, we're reaching a point where it's getting very hard to develop. Could we carve out some time to go clean this up? And then we come full circle back to what we talked about with Andy and folks earlier, which is schedule that tech debt, make a business case for it. And if you can predict before it gets too nuts to try and maintain, then you can address it. I hope that helps. Anthony, let me know if that makes sense. Moving along here. I think another thing that I added was understanding of who needs to sign off on pull requests. which might sound funny. There are situations I've seen where, you might put up a pull request and it automatically adds a couple reviewers, or maybe you add someone manually or add two people, and there might be that implicit expectation that whoever you add, they're going to sign off. But there are situations where someone's like, hey, like, I know so and so is working in this space and maybe a couple other people. It would be really good if they had visibility on this. Maybe the new intern or the new junior engineer, like, it would be really good if they could see this so they could read through it and understand it. But maybe in those cases, you don't actually care if they sign off on the pull request. You're not genuinely looking for their feedback and their input. Maybe they have it and that's great, but maybe you're not trying to block the review on their input, because, again, double-edged sword here. You might want to add people for visibility, but the trade-off is that now your gate, the gatekeepers, you have 10 gatekeepers. Is that actually what you want? Maybe in some cases, but probably not in all. Like, you don't need like an army of people that need to sign off on your pull request. It's pretty rare that that's a thing that you need. So I think code review culture wise, having clear expectations about who needs to be reviewing things, if you're adding reviewers on just to check them out. Maybe different code review systems have different roles. Like maybe there's like a reviewer and just like a spectator or something. I don't know. But treat them like that, right? You might want to say this person's here just for visibility. And that way the person who owns the review, they're not waiting for or like chasing people down to sign off on things. They're just like, okay, like Jimmy has, he's just watching this thing for input because he's trying to learn about it, but I'm not waiting for him, right? You might say, hey, anyone who's on here, by default, if you're on here, even if you're not reviewing, like you can sign off as like a, approve but needs others' input. Like depending on the code review system, there's options like that. But my point is that you want to have a clear expectation with your team on this, because this can be a huge source of friction where people will say, it takes me a week to chase people down and they don't even have input. I don't know, like do something about it. Talk to your team about what's happening, right? Like you can work together on this and improve it. Okay, another one, and this one is again a double-edged sword. I wrote, try to encourage team members to prioritize getting pull requests reviewed and moved along. Now, pull requests, like other things, can be something that's disruptive. All right, you're working on code, you're developing software, and you get an email notification, someone pings you on Slack, Teams, Discord, whatever you're using, not Zoom, and they're going, hey, I'm waiting for your review. And you're like, oh crap, okay, and like now context switch, right? So you lose 20 minutes in your context switch for overhead. Now you got to go do the review. And then, you start getting back in your coding and someone else pings you again, right? So it's a tricky thing to say, like prioritize it, because I don't mean drop everything you're doing all the time all at once to go review code. But I do mean that as a team, if you can try to think about like, I want to help unblock other people. If you have that like as a cultural belief on the team, that's something you value, I think that it can help dramatically speed up effectiveness. And it's because we spend so much time having code sitting in review state. I got eyelashes in my eye. I can't see what's going on. But I hope that makes sense, right? So how do you do a better job of that? Well, you can block out time, right? You might say, instead of me getting pinged every 5 minutes to jump on reviews and I can't get my work done, let me carve out a block of time where I'm not going to code, but I'm going to sit down and go through my reviews. And I'll make a case for it, and that's when I'm going to do them, and you can dedicate time to it so you're not context switching back and forth. There's no one right way to do this, but this is a thing of balance. I just think it's important that if you think pull requests and code reviews are valuable, how can you make sure that the context switching effort is low? Try to prioritize them, get them through, because that's how you ship value. Okay, what else we got here? The next thing I wrote was about batching your time. Okay. I did say this one because this is maybe something that comes from more junior perspective, younger engineers and stuff. I said, don't just add a buddy that blindly signs off on your pull requests. We've all done it. Don't sit there listening to me going, no, I've never would even think about that. You've done it. It's okay. I've done it. You want to get your stuff through. You want to ship the value to the customer. What's the best way to do it? Get the person who's going to give you a thumbs up. Maybe your code review system allows you to approve your own stuff. Don't, but like maybe, right? Like it's in our nature that we want to move things along. So especially, and this why I want to talk about this is that there are situations on teams where sure, maybe most of your team is very cooperative and you're happy to work with them and getting stuff up for review. But I think many of us have been in teams where there's one or more individuals where you almost dread getting them on a code review. And you dread it because you know that as soon as they get onto that code review and they start commenting, well, first of all, you know they're going to comment. And you know that once they start commenting, that you have more work to do. So instead of going down that path, you go, well, Jimmy always leaves tons of comments. Jimmy always makes more work for me. I'm just going to add Steve or Sally. Let me pick Sally so I have a mix of names here. So Jimmy sucks. Sally's in. I'm never putting Jimmy on another review. Right? We avoid the problem and then we go for the goal of trying to get the stuff through quicker. And that might feel good, but we're avoiding a problem. And the problem is that, and I almost said Jimmy sucks at communicating, but what's a better way to say this? It's that we have poor communication with Jimmy. It's two ways, right? So if Jimmy is the person who's always leaving you comments on your review and you're like, I just feel like I can't get work done with Jimmy, guess what? You should have a conversation with Jimmy about how you want to make sure that you can live up to the code review expectations. You can say, hey, look, I notice I get a lot of comments. I just want to make sure that I can understand where you're coming from on some of these things, right? Not everyone's that agreeable. Maybe Jimmy is a jerk, in which case maybe it's a good opportunity to bring some visibility about that. Hopefully not, though. I don't like thinking that people are malicious. Most of the time they're not. TikTok is trying to shut me down again. I don't think so. There we go. So I think that you should try to not avoid people on pull requests. I'm saying that as someone who has done it before. I absolutely know the feeling. It sucks because you're like, I just want to get my work done and I know Jimmy is going to make another whole week of work for me. But instead of avoiding it, try to get ahead of it. If you know Jimmy's going to have a bunch of stuff for you to go do and fix up, why don't you talk to Jimmy sooner about your designs? Why not get it done sooner, get the feedback, right? Like, it's easier said than done, I know, but I just want you to think about this kind of stuff so that you can stop avoiding it because, big surprise, there's always going to be people like that. So you can keep trying to run away from them, but they're always going to be there. So you might as well try to find a way to work with them collaboratively. Okay, next thing. As a reviewer, make your feedback actionable. That doesn't mean that you can't say like, hey, this is a nitpick or like a small thing. Like you can do that kind of stuff. Be clear about it, right? If something's a nitpick, you're like, not going to block your review on this, but by the way, like that's actually a compound word. So you want to capitalize the second part of this, like not a big deal. Sure. Like you might say nitpick, whatever. But my point is that when you leave feedback, make it actionable. Doing something like if you say this is the wrong pattern, leaving a comment that just says test ? Or this won't work, period. Wrong design pattern. Didn't we talk about this ? Like, that kind of stuff it's just not helpful. And again, I don't like to think that people are malicious. I don't think that someone's sitting at their desk and being like, oh man, I can't wait to lay into this guy. Like, they put their jerk hat on and they're like, oh, I hate my whole team. Like, I don't think I don't think people do that. It's ridiculous because you're on the same team. They want their code base to be good. They want to ship value to customers. You all want the same thing. So it's not that people are malicious generally, but I think that the way people communicate is not that effective most of the time. So if you can be cognizant of this, and maybe you are that person, sorry, if you can be cognizant of the feedback that you're giving, like what are you hoping to see in terms of changes? Because if someone has to write a comment back to you to be like you said patterns wrong, and they're like, well, what should I use? Like, you could have saved that whole step and said, hey, this is one of the patterns that we actually retired a couple years back, and we've moved over to this one. You can actually find a reference to it in this file over here. Here's why we use it. Right? Like, here's what's wrong with it, or we could improve. Here's where you go see an example of it. Here's why. Great. Test ? And then you don't say anything. Like, what you're trying to say is like, hey, look, I would love to assume that you have validated these changes. I would also love to assume that you have some regression coverage somewhere. I happen to not see it. So, like, could you walk me through some of the scenarios that you've thought about for testing on this? How are we making sure it's validated? And how do we have regression coverage? Like, it's a simple thing, but kind of lead people in the direction. Don't just like be a jerk about it. You might not notice you're being a jerk, but when you're super short with comments and advice and it doesn't feel actionable, people don't know what action to take. So again, it takes a little bit of training and introspection to realize if you're just being really short in what you're asking for or stating on a review, people may not know. And then you might get frustrated with them when they go make a change and you're like, dude, that's still not the right thing. Like, how could you not get it? And it's because you're not telling them what you're expecting to see. So try to be a little bit more aware of that. I think that's very important. And that can make a big change. Okay, next thing. Try not to take things on reviews personally. This is probably the easiest thing to say and the hardest thing to do. I have talked to people, especially, I know a couple of exchanges on Twitter where people were saying, I don't own the code. I have no attachment to it. I don't take anything personally. And I go, that's super cool. That's not what I'm like at all. I very much feel like code is an expression of how I think. Right? I'm taking logic that's up here. I like to think there's logic up here somewhere. And I'm taking the logic and I'm putting it down into the code. And then someone comes along and they're like, this is wrong. And I'm sitting there going, excuse me, you're basically just telling me that my brain is wrong. Like, how dare you? I'm exaggerating a little bit, right? But like, that's kind of the feeling that we get when people start critiquing our code. I think for a lot of people, like it's very easy for it to feel personal. We layer in a couple more things. I mentioned earlier that written communication is absolutely terrible. It's a poor mechanism for communicating things, right? I could say the same things with different tones and, volume in my voice, and I might sound very happy versus very angry. You can see my facial expressions as I'm talking to you. So you can tell if I'm smiling and I'm talking to you like this versus if I'm like, I can't make a mad face, I'm going to laugh at myself. But if I was looking angry at you and changed the tone of my voice and I was shouting, even though I'm saying the same words, you go, oh, this guy's angry, right? Like, we don't get that a lot of the time in code reviews. And it's very easy to start basically inventing how other people sound when they're talking to you. So you might have this experience where you're like, someone's basically making me feel like I'm stupid because they're challenging how I think. And it sounds like they're angry at me. Who does this Jimmy guy think he is? And then you start to resent them. And then you go to that spot where you're like, I'm never adding Jimmy onto the code review again. Right? But you need to do some work on your part to not take things so personally. It's very difficult to do. But I've had a couple people offer a similar suggestion around this, and I don't want to butcher it, but like they basically said, imagine that your best friend. So you're not best friends with Jimmy, right? But imagine in this case, this example, Jimmy was leaving you code review comments. You're feeling kind of resentful of Jimmy. But imagine it was your best friend, Sally. And imagine Sally was leaving you those comments. Would you change your mind about how you feel about the comments? It's a really interesting exercise, right? You might go, yeah, like, well, Sally wants me to do good things. Like, Sally means well. So you start to look at the comments in a different context. So I think it's a really helpful exercise. Try to practice it, because I know if you're watching this, I can guarantee if you put up a code review before, you have had someone that's reviewed it and you're like, I wish they didn't because they made you feel not good. But try to imagine your best friend is the one giving you the feedback and see how that changes things. Okay, the last one I'm going to mention here, and then we're going to go back to the thing I said at the beginning, because I hope you were thinking about it. If you joined late in the stream, shame on you, first of all. No, I'm just kidding. But I mentioned earlier in the stream, what does it look like, or why, like what's the world that we would live in where maybe pull requests and code reviews don't make sense? So we're going to wrap up with that one. So last part here, try to communicate goals and expectations around timelines for pull requests. This goes back to something I was saying earlier about delivering value to customers, right? If we are spending a tremendous amount of time on a code review where the impact of that thing actually has a time sensitive or time critical aspect to it, should you be debating about the white space and delaying delivering the feature that the customer needs yesterday by another 2 weeks because the white space is off? A little bit of an exaggeration, right? But like, is that a valuable use of time? I think it's really important to have context about what you're delivering, because, time is a constraint that exists in real life. And I think sometimes when we're developing software, we like to think that it doesn't, because if we don't have a time constraint, we can go make things perfect. Another spoiler alert, no such thing. So we use up a lot of time trying to make things the best that they can be, but there is a point of diminishing returns. So I think being able to communicate in some capacity, some expectation around when this needs to go out, right? For us in Substrate, we follow safe deployment practices, right? So things will roll out purposefully not at light speed. We purposefully roll them out at a slower speed that we feel comfortable with. We have flighting tools on top of those rollouts as well, so that even though binaries are being delivered, we can turn off and on features. So we have all of these things. And you might be in a position where you're like, I need to have my change saturated out across the world by a deadline. Like, that's the goal that we've set. And I know that I have these mechanisms to turn things off and on. Like basically what I'm getting at is, like, you should have a conversation about what your plan is for this going further, and make sure that people understand, because every little bit helps there. It might save you some frustration of people not reviewing their stuff because they think that your change doesn't have to be out for another 2 weeks anyway, so who cares? They don't know that the VP was talking to your manager and they said, if this thing doesn't go out yesterday, there's fire under your butt, you better move faster, like that kind of thing. Like, if you can have conversations, you can save a lot of frustration. So it's a simple piece of advice. Okay, now before I have to do this because I don't do a good job of it, so I apologize in advance, but before I go back to the question that I had at the very beginning of this about what is a world without pull requests and code reviews, I do need to mention that I have courses available. That's my opportunity to sell you things. No, I just want to mention them briefly. I'm not even going to switch my screen to show you them, but I have courses on Dome Train if you want to learn about C#. I have one that takes you from no experience at all It's about 5 hours long, gets you to the very basics of basically no programming to working in C#, and then a follow-up on that that's 6.5 hours, and that gets you to building basic applications, hopefully with a bit of confidence. So together, there's a bundle. It's 11.5 hours long. It's a 20% discount to get them together. So it's at Dome Train, and maybe I will just put that in the chat so you can check it out if you're interested. There is a refactoring course that's available. So if you are building stuff, oh, awesome. So Rambling Geek on Twitch is saying, I found you on YouTube, Twitch from Dome Train. Perfect. That's what we're talking about. There's a refactoring course if you want to learn about refactoring. So that's a bunch of my experiences from startup world that I mentioned earlier on the stream about how to navigate code bases and try to clean them up. Because, again, spoiler alert, code that lives for a long time is probably going to look pretty messy by the end of it. And I wanted to announce that I am working on my 4th course for Dome Train. I have another one planned basically immediately after that. So hopefully I'll have 5 of them out in total by the end of this year. And another surprise course that I'll be working on. I can't reveal anything on that, but if you're interested, if you like my courses, my style of teaching, please do follow along because I'll be talking about them. It's hard to say, as they get announced. And then the last thing I wanted to mention before I go back to the before I go back to the code review question of the evening is that if you are interested in creating content, because I've been doing this now consistently for about 18 months. Thank you for all of you that have been following along and kind of seeing my journey, still very early in the journey. I have a content strategy, I guess, that I've kind of, I don't want to say I invented it because that wouldn't be fair to say, but a content strategy that I follow. And I decided I'm going to put my energy into making that something that is useful for others. So I created something called Brand Ghost. It's not yet launched, but one sec, I will put that in the chat as well if you want to see it. I did see the question about WPF as well, so I will answer that in just a moment. So Brand Ghost, I will put in the chat. If you are interested in creating content, if you like how I've been approaching it, this is the strategy that I use. So you can check that out in the chat. The entire goal of that platform is that you can either scale up your content creation to allow you to create more, or you can do the opposite. You can put yourself into a situation where you've created content and you can take a step back and not feel like you're perpetually trying to create more content. I've seen both sides of this as a creator where you're like, I need to do more. I don't have time. I basically literally follow this exact content strategy, but I'm building an application for it. And people have said to me, how do you produce so much content? And I basically, in the back of my mind, I've been thinking, if I wasn't putting this content strategy together, I'd be making even more content, but I have to go build this thing at the same time on top of my 9-to-5 job. So the goal of that is just to help you get more steady with creating content. And then once you are very steady with it, I will be taking a vacation this week coming up. So Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday, not going to be around. And I will still have content going out because I put in the work ahead of time over the past 18 months to make sure that I can take vacation. So that's what Brand Ghost will help with. I'm hoping that it will help other people that want to start off with their creation for content. And yeah, hopefully find that interesting. Are you going to be continuing WPF application work? Yes, I will be. Actually, I should mention this too. I'm going to try to live stream tomorrow morning. I guess based on Rambling Geek, based on the fact that you said good morning, it's probably the evening for you when I go to stream. I'm going to try to stream. Oh, it's going to be early. I can't promise. I want to be online at 7 a.m. PST tomorrow. So that will be Tuesday for me. 7 a.m. Fingers crossed. I'm going to be going through some WPF stuff. I want to get some videos recorded, sent out to my editor so I can get them back and have them queued up for Friday and Monday and hopefully Wednesday next week because I won't be here. So some things Brand Ghost will not replace. Brand Ghost will not replace me creating YouTube videos, but Brand Ghost will absolutely help me with getting my content put out there, especially when I'm not around. So we'll be trying to do that. And then, yeah, I'll have WPF videos going out. WPF for me, I've spent years, years and years and years building in WPF. My entire job before Microsoft for 8 years was WinForms, and then moving over to WPF for 8 years, right? So, and before that, I built WinForms since I was ever like learned to program. So it's just been a while for me. So I've lost the muscle memory and I'm trying to get all that stuff back. So if you watch my stream tomorrow when I'm coding, you'll be like, dude, have you ever worked in WPF? It'll come back, I promise. But I'm hoping to try and show some different patterns that I leveraged in WPF. And it kind of feels like you're fighting against the framework sometimes, but I have found that they help with testability and extensibility. So I like sharing those. So hopefully you can make it. If not, it will be recorded. So that's the thing too. But folks, it's almost 11 p.m. It is my bedtime. So thank you so much for joining. Thanks for all the chat questions. If I guess next week, because I will be on vacation, I will not be doing the stream. So I apologize. But the week after, and hopefully every Monday, 9:30 p.m. PST, I will be having streams just like this one. And I look forward to hearing from you and being able to answer your questions. Makes me feel good to be able to help. So thank you. Okay, folks.